Welcome to How Ecology Works. In this podcast, we cover all topics in ecology and how you might apply them in your future career. Hey everybody, welcome back to How Ecology Works. Today we're with Jordan Nanney, and he works with the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, managing forest stands for wildlife in a variety of contexts, and has a lot of experience doing that. And I thought it was a perfect opportunity for us to talk about forest stand improvement or timber stand improvement practices and when we might use those, what that means, and how they may affect some focal species of interest, particularly in the eastern United States where you work.
Sounds great. I'm looking forward to that. I have worked in capacities where I did commercial timber sales, but also in this particular position, we concentrate a lot on non-commercial practices that are often targeted for TSI or FSI objectives. And I think those are underused in our profession. So I look forward to discussing these because many of the undergraduates across the nation that are in wildlife management or wildlife ecology programs are missing out on this information. And when they enter the workforce, this is an important tool they can have in their tool bag to help meet their habitat management or forest management objectives.
Sure. And that's something that, depending on what kind of job you're in, you may be doing really frequently. You know, wildlife need habitat, and you're talking about practices that we can use to improve habitat for a targeted group of species.
Absolutely. And particularly in the eastern U.S., our landscape is very forested. In Tennessee, we're dominated by hardwood systems, but obviously down in Florida, you have a large component of pine systems. But forest stand improvement and timber stand improvement practices can be used in both strategically to accomplish objectives.
Okay, you keep separating those things. So can you tell us what is a timber stand improvement versus a forest stand improvement, and are they different, and if so, how?
The practices that are used to accomplish timber stand improvement versus forest stand improvement objectives are very similar, but the objective is what separates the two. Timber stand improvement concentrates on improving a forest stand for the purpose of timber quality and timber value. So you're improving the stand for the trees. Forest stand improvement, you're improving the stand often for wildlife habitat management objectives. It could be other ecological objectives that aren't related to habitat, but usually it's to accomplish some kind of habitat management objective.
Okay, so that makes sense. So when I'm talking in the class, I'll talk about silvicultural practices that the intent is to regenerate a new forest. So we'd have a regeneration technique. And you're telling me now we also have a timber stand improvement practice. So we may go in and implement a practice like thinning, for instance, where the intent or the objective of that practice is not to regenerate a new forest. In that case, for timber stand improvement, it would be to improve the quality of the trees for the next harvest or the final harvest, right?
Improve quality and improve growth rate.
Yeah. So our focus in that case, the objective is to improve the performance of our crop trees.
Absolutely.
Whereas the forest stand improvement is actually neither of those objectives. We care very little, or that's not really a top objective related to regeneration or the timber production. It's focused on another objective, which you commonly use the objectives related to wildlife habitat.
Yes, that's a great way to describe it. In my role now, I'm fortunate that wildlife ranks number one. I work for a wildlife agency, so I can do a lot of creative things with forest stand improvement practices that would be viewed as almost irresponsible from a forester's standpoint or a forest industry standpoint, because I may be killing very valuable trees to the forestry market. But from a wildlife standpoint, the money that comes from a tree into the economy for people is not that doesn't make a difference on how that animal is going to use the resources provided by that particular tree or species.
Mm.
So I can ignore some of those economic pressures that folks in the timber management or forest management realm have to concentrate on. And it might have gotten a little off topic, but I think for folks that are in an ecology class, it's important to understand you're going to get pressures from folks for implementing forest stand improvement practices that have an objective of wildlife habitat, because you're not going to maximize the production of that forest from a timber perspective.
I think the important thing, I'll let you finish in just a second, but the important thing also is, depending on whether it's your livelihood, some landowners might, they're trying to balance it more than you have to because of your role. But there are trade-offs to what your objectives are and decisions are in these stands. And I think that's a really important point.
But, sure.
Please finish it.
Well, I was kind of getting to that in a way. You can hybridize the objectives. You don't have to maximize one or the other. So working with private landowners is a perfect example of that. But if you're in a role where wildlife is the objective, or a particular species is the objective, in the future, don't let the pressures from other industries cause you to lessen the effectiveness of your treatment, because you're trying to safeguard these other objectives.
You don't want to not achieve your objective because of pressures from other interests or other objective holders.
And I run into that all the time, because I work with foresters and wildlife biologists.
Mm-hmm. And you often have different objectives for what you're trying to do, and you may even on the same ground in some cases.
Absolutely. And when you boil it down, the most important thing to do is clearly define your objectives.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure everybody understands the thing we're trying to accomplish with this particular practice.
Sure. So can you give us some examples of what some of these practices are, and give us a couple of maybe target species and, her habitat components that you're targeting, and just give us a good idea of how this works in your day-to-day work life.
In most cases, the practices we use are chemical based, using a hack and squirt technique where you take a hatchet or a machete and you're hacking wounds into the tree, getting down to the cambium layer under the bark, injecting herbicide into those wounds. And then over time, over that growing season or the next, that tree will die and provide sunlight or lessen competition to trees around it.
Mm-hmm.
You can also use a girdle and spray technique where you use a chainsaw. You create a wound that encompasses the entire circumference of that tree. So
Mm-hmm.
you girdle the entire stem of that tree and you spray herbicide in it. Make sure you get through the bark into the cambium.
Mm-hmm.
Now, these are hardwood specific techniques I'm speaking of right now. If you were dealing in pine or cedar that don't stump sprout, or
Mm-hmm.
for the vast majority of them will not, you could essentially girdle it and leave it.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't have to use the herbicide. But those two techniques are used widely
Mm-hmm.
to accomplish these forest stand improvement or timber stand improvement objectives. You can also use mechanical means. So
Mm-hmm.
the chainsaw without the herbicide essentially is a mechanical.
Sure.
Chainsaw with the herbicide is a combination.
Before you move on from the herbicide, can you give some examples of what you would use? Like what do you commonly use in terms of the chemicals?
In my role in the forest systems I work with, a great mixture is to use 50% Garlon 3A, 40% water, and 10% Arsenal AC. AC stands for applicator's concentrate. It's a more concentrated form of regular Arsenal. If you're
Mm-hmm.
using regular Arsenal, it would be 20% because AC has double the concentration of a Mazepir. But just to recap that, 50% Garland 3A, 40% water, 10% Arsenal AC, mixed in that order. Triclopyr and Garland versus imazapyr and Arsenal. If you mix those without the water in between, you end up with a reaction that will kind of
it's antagonistic.
Yeah, it will start to solidify and create an issue in your spray bottle. You can also use one or the other if you understand the species you're dealing with. Oftentimes, I have a wide variety of species in a forest that I may be treating. So that's a great mixture in a hardwood system to accomplish.
So that's one really common way, and I assume that you're using that technique when those trees, for some other reason, are not merchantable.
Yes. I always use, I do kill merchantable trees, but if the entire stand is, if the majority of the trees we're going to be treating are small or poor quality trees, then the economic considerations are not there for a commercial sale. So the vast majority of timber stand improvement or forest stand improvement practices are going to be pre-commercial or non-commercial.
Yeah.
Which means you're paying money to get it accomplished.
Yeah. So there are some circumstances, and we would certainly promote these, especially if people were working on private lands where the economic consideration may be much more important. There are situations where you could use similar techniques that are merchantable, or in other words, you can make money from selling the timber that you're removing. Yeah. So you definitely would want to use that when possible, but oftentimes that may not help you meet your objectives as quickly as you can with these other practices.
Right. Another practice we've used, particularly in West Tennessee, in our bottomland hardwood stands. So West Tennessee, just for a quick background, we've had a program where we've converted old retired agricultural fields that are really too wet to farm anymore to native bottomland hardwood forest systems. And when they were planted originally, when these bottomland hardwood species planted in these old ag fields, they were planted in rows, kind of like pine trees. Well, now they're getting to the point where they're competing heavily and getting non-target species.
Mid-rotation in terms of
exactly. It's just like a pine system. So we used a pre-commercial thinning technique we've used chemical, but we've also used cut and slashing essentially. And I've seen that with naturally regenerated pines where you use slashing. You go through with a crew and cut trees to get it to an adequate spacing because it's overstocked.
Yeah.
So those are mechanical techniques.
So what are you actually trying to accomplish? You've talked a lot about killing trees, whether we're selling them or not. But what are you trying to get from that? Why is that the focus of what you're doing with these practices?
The two primary objectives we're trying to accomplish with techniques, regardless of whether we're moving towards a habitat management program or moving towards a forest management program, we're adjusting the composition and we're increasing sunlight availability. And so overall, you evaluate your forest stand and you decide which species or which particular trees you would like to keep. And then you use these herbicide or mechanical techniques, pre-commercial or commercial, to remove the trees you don't want, leave the trees you do want. And then you manipulate the overstory, but you're also manipulating the understory because you're gaining that sunlight availability, which is so important when managing for most of our native wildlife species.
Well, it's very important, no question, for a lot of the game species that your agency focuses on, because a lot of the constituency, a lot of the funding is coming from there, and those sorts of things. But a lot of people probably don't realize that, at least in the eastern United States, many of our species of conservation concern, that include many non-game species, also are disturbance dependent.
Absolutely.
And that's what you're trying to do is create the forest stand conditions that promote the structural characteristics in the forest that those species need.
And from an ecological perspective, our forests are very different than they were, and they're different from the way they're originally adapted to be, I guess, is particularly talking about oak forests. You're involved in research looking at the flammability of different leaf species and how that composition of leaf litter can affect your ability to use prescribed fire. Well, a forest stand improvement practice could go through and target those species that are inhibiting your ability to use fire effectively, and transition you back in a more efficient way than almost any other technique. So,
well, it's really interesting to think about that, especially in Tennessee, but I think in a lot of the eastern U.S., we've had a history of disrupting some of the disturbances that maintained those open forest conditions. And if you go way back, I mean, even to the maps that were drawn by Bartram, he called most of the eastern U.S. Grand Savanne, where translation is Big Savannah. And if we think about savannas and woodlands, we don't have that much of that on the landscape now. And what you're talking about are ways that we could very effectively and quickly convert stands to that type of condition that promote a lot of the wildlife that evolved with those characteristics, as part of their life history.
That's it. Having the ability to adjust that composition is huge, because if the forest system has not been managed for whatever your particular objective is in your role, then it's not going to be what you want it to be when you walk in there. So you're going to have to adjust that composition.
Take actions to improve that habitat. And just to reiterate, a lot of our species, and I would bet, I'm not sure what the proportion of species of conservation concern or disturbance dependent, but my bet would be that they're dominant on that list. Right. The species in the eastern United States, at least, that we're most concerned about in terms of their population trajectories or whatever, are those species that need these type of disturbances. And I think one thing that's important to point out, and you certainly know this, and we need to make certain, I guess, that this idea is well known in our field, is oftentimes landowners or constituencies with these agencies are interested in game species like deer and turkeys and quail, but those species also need those same characteristics that we're talking about. Those are improvements to habitat for those species, and by using that as a conduit to getting these practices implemented on larger portions of the landscape, we are positively influencing many species of conservation concern that are not the focus necessarily specifically for that objective, but we know that we're improving habitat for those species at the same time. I think that's a really important take-home message, and I think you would agree with that.
100%.
Yeah. So I really appreciate you taking some time to come on and talk to us about that. It's really great to get your perspective on it, and I know we've known each other for a long time. I knew that you'd be a good one to talk to about this, but getting to hear from somebody who actually is implementing this stuff on the ground on a day-to-day basis, I think is really important. And I applaud you for that, and thank you for coming on to talk to us about it.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it, Marcus.
Yeah. See you later. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining the show. Thanks for listening to How Ecology Works. If you're interested in more topics like this, follow us at ufdeerlab.